I'm the president of New Plaza, and we are a nonprofit cinema. In this, our sci-fi film month, we're looking forward to discussing a solid, uh, sometimes scary film called War of the Worlds, a fictional film, even though the title may seem a little, may hit a nerve these days. And now it's our great pleasure to introduce our wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez. Max?
Thank you so much, Norma, and good afternoon, friends and supporters of New Plaza Cinema. Norma's comment is entirely appropriate given the historical nature of the H.G. Wells novel, which inspired this 1953 George Pal Byron Haskins science fiction thriller, which celebrates its 70th anniversary this year. It has also spawned, and I'm talking about the H.G. Wells source matter, has spawned a TV series from the late 80s to 1990. There was a 2019 TV series, and of course, Steven Spielberg's remake in 2005. But this story of a Martian invasion is also remembered for a version that aired on All Hallows Eve, 1938, on the CBS radio network. This was from Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater group that memorably presented a modernized version of the novel that caused tremendous panic around the country. The Welles program was designed to satirize a news radio broadcast, so random radio listeners were taken aback by broadcaster-like accounts of invasion and destruction. The newspapers greatly exaggerated the national impact of the 1938 War of the Worlds because they hated radio for cutting into their circulation numbers. But Wells's take on the other Wells, that's HG, did create panic among many listeners who were more than aware of the explosive political events heating up in Europe in late 1938. So I do want to make it clear to anyone tuning in this afternoon or watching this later via the internet that this talkback is about a purely fictional War of the Worlds, an attack against the Earth by, of all things, Martian spacecraft. This is a follow-up to Dan Cahill's memorable presentation this past week on 1950s sci-fi movies, and Dan is going to be joining me in just a little while to talk about the visual look of this 1953 Paramount feature, which I saw when I was about 12 years old in 16 millimeter in what appears to be a pirated black and white print. There was a film society in Milwaukee, my hometown, that ran movies at the long gone Plymouth Church, and they showed a black and white print of War of the Worlds. I had no idea this was a color film until a few years later. I was at a downtown cinema and they were running some kind of a advertisement for something that featured a color clip from the film of the Martian spacecraft zapping Los Angeles. And I was shocked that War of the Worlds was in Technicolor. It's unusual because this was a very generously budgeted sci-fi for the 1950s. Dan is going to tell us more about that, but we generally associate that decade and that era with comparatively low-budget B-oriented productions about aliens and spacecraft and space creatures that were designed for the bottom halves of double bills and eventually drive-in environments. Productions that would have been produced by American International Pictures and Roger Corman and Allied Artists. But here we had Paramount Pictures funding to the tune of about $2 million, multiply that by 10 today, a Technicolor film based on an H.G. Wells sci-fi story. They saved money by not having a big name cast, as we shall see. And we're going to take a look at the original trailer for War of the Worlds to see how Paramount sold this film in 1953. Well, they didn't have a lot of actors to promote, but there's a lot of other selling points that they used to pull out all stops in terms of showmanship. Here's the original War of the Worlds trailer.
This could be the beginning of the end for the human race. For what men first thought were meteors or the often ridiculed flying saucers are in reality the flaming vanguard of the invasion from Mars.
Looks like they're going to come out of that gully pretty soon. We'll have to rush our defenses to be ready when they do.
The guards need plenty of reinforcements.
We'll get them. Lieutenant, look!
They slashed across country like scythes, wiping out everything that's trying to get away from them.
That explains why communication is cut the moment their machines begin moving.
Montreal's blacked out. Nothing more's come through.
Same thing that happened on the Pacific coast. Anything from them yet?
No, Mr. Secretary, we've had nothing from San Francisco for over 5 hours.
The nations of the world mobilize their armed might, rushing to defend the Earth against the unknown weapons of the super race from the Red Planet. Is there nothing that can stop the Martian death machines?
Guns, tanks, bombs. They're like toys against them.
We know now that we can't beat their machines. We've got to beat them.
All over the world, human beings cower before the onslaught of these unearthly enemies, whom no one has ever seen. Panic that sweeps around the globe as the great masses of mankind flee blindly in a headlong stampede of hysteria.
Once again, unusual to see a very generously budgeted sci-fi film in 1953. Although, I mean, this was also the year that Warner Brothers funded House of Wax in color in 3D, a horror picture. So it wasn't entirely unusual, but not as frequent as it should be. The American Film Institute catalog reported that there were numerous major directors who attempted initially to bring the 1898 H.G. Wells novel to the screen, dating back to Cecil B. DeMille in the 1920s. Apparently, Sergei Eisenstein, when he was briefly under contract to Paramount in the early 30s, was considering a version. I would have loved to have seen an Eisenstein sci-fi movie. Apparently, Alfred Hitchcock was mulling the idea of bringing this to the screen in England when he was under contract to Gaumont British in the mid-1930s. And apparently, George Pal, the producer, who I'll talk more about, had hoped to be more faithful to the H.G. Wells novel, but Paramount production head Don Hartman insisted on the love subplot between Gene Raymond and Anne Robinson. And in one particular fascinating bit of trivia, Lee Marvin apparently was originally considered for the role that Gene Barry had as the scientist. Wouldn't that have made a fascinating situation? Historian Bill Warren, who I used to work with in Los Angeles, was able to identify some locations for War of the Worlds in Los Angeles, such as the South Brendan's Catholic Church on Van Ness as the location of the climactic religious scene. There's also some remarkable location filming on the early Hollywood freeway, which was not that old when they were filming the evacuation from Los Angeles, and those striking scenes of Barry running through a pretty much desolate downtown Los Angeles. I just took some random notes watching this film again after so many years. I'm sure Dan is going to have a lot to say about the fact that the movie opens in black and white, even with a black and white Paramount logo. That's pretty arty for a Technicolor film to do at the time. There's some in-jokes there. There's a cinema showing Samson and Delilah, another Paramount release that was making quite an impact at the box office. We have the political aspects of War of the Worlds, where the Martians are causing and wreaking havoc around the world, but only certain countries are identified with fighting the Martians. India and Finland and Bolivia, and even China, who was technically considered a Cold War threat at the time, but no mention made at all of Russia and how the Martian invasion was impacting Russia. There are certain images that I'll never forget that are still great to me. The Martian craft floating through the smoke of the atomic bomb, which has failed to stop them. Those amazing evacuation scenes in Los Angeles, which have almost a film noir feel to them. And the tremendous miniature work in this day of computerized recreations of cities, the fact that those buildings that get blown to pieces by the Martians were crafted at Paramount are quite impressive. We'll talk more, I'm sure, about what is the film saying from a religious and political point of view. It is unusual, and Dan and I were just chatting about this before we began, to have any American film, especially from this era, have a scientist as its hero. I mean, the scientist of Gene Barry, he's not mad, and his fellow scientists are very decent and genuinely concerned. The military, which is supposed to be all mighty and powerful and brilliant in a Hollywood production of this era, is kind of incompetent. All their efforts to stop the Martian invasion fail embarrassingly, even the use of the atomic bomb. So it's unusual in that sense, but at the same time, there's the religious angle, which was not prevalent in the H.G. Wells novel. Wells was not religious in his views, and the curate, the religious character known in this film as Uncle Matthew, he's seen as a bit more heroic here as he martyrs himself in front of the Martians, was not seen quite that way in the novels. So you have to get a sense that there were pressures brought to bear on the movie makers by certainly the censorship entities of the time, particularly the Joseph Breen Production Code Administration, which was very pro-religion and pro-Catholicism in its approach to narratives. A few words about the people who made A War of the Worlds before we hear from Dan. Producer George Pal, many of my generation worshipped him as kids because he was into the fantastic, imaginative special effects stories in the late 50s and early 60s. He was born in Hungary in 1908. He died in 1980, according to historian Ephraim Katz. He was an architecture major, and George Pal is the producer of The War of the Worlds. He was an architecture major in Budapest at the Academy of Arts there. He began his film career in Hungary. Then he designed sets in Berlin or in Germany for the great UFA studios. Then he did puppet shows in Holland. He started working in Hollywood in 1940 as World War II was heating up, producing the popular and award-winning Puppetoons series for Paramount Pictures, which featured animated puppets. One of the characters being the pixelated puppet Jasper, a black character that had a number of shorts produced for Paramount. And Pal won some Academy Award for a special Academy Award in 1943 for his animated puppet work. He's going to become a producer and a special effects designer for such sci-fi films in the 50s as Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide, in addition to The War of the Worlds, for which he won an Academy Award. He'll also produce a not factually accurate version of Houdini with Tony Curtis, The Conquest of Space in 1955, a late 60s film called The Power, and then in the mid-70s, Doc Savage, The Man of Bronze. He's going to become a producer and director and a special effects supervisor, and he'll win an Oscar for Tom Thumb in 1958. And a great favorite of mine as a kid, another H.G. Wells adaptation of The Time Machine in 1960 with Rod Taylor, Atlantis, The Lost Continent, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, which made the Grimm brothers seem a lot more fun to read than they really were, which was made in Cinerama, three-camera Cinerama, and co-directed with Henry Levin. And then director Byron Haskin was born in Portland, passed away in 1984. He started out as a newspaper cartoonist and an advertising man before entering the film business as an assistant cameraman, assistant director. He became a director of photography, the cinematographer, in the early 1920s, even directed some silent films, did production work in England, returned to Hollywood to join Warner Brothers in the special effects department in the late 30s. He and his team are going to do special effects for directors such as Michael Curtiz, Busby Berkeley, Raoul Walsh, films like Black Fury and The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, The Roaring Twenties, High Sierra, John Huston's Across the Pacific, Frank Capra's Arsenic and Old Lace. His feature directing credits are generally standard studio assignments. There is, however, a film noir, Too Late for Tears, in 1949. There's another one, The Naked Jungle, in 1956, which George Powell produced. And there's a fascinating political noir that Byron Haskin directed in 1956 called The Boss with John Payne, which was written without credit by the blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo. And then there are some more fantasy-related pictures, including Robinson Crusoe on Mars in the early 1960s. We'll talk more about the actors in this film, The War of the Worlds, but by now I know that our cinematography and visual consultant specialist, Daniel Cahill, has a lot to say about the look of this 1953 Paramount release in Technicolor. Welcome, Dan. We can't wait to hear what you have to offer.
Thank you, Max. And I have to react to your introductory anecdote about first seeing this in black and white. Oh,
shocking, isn't it?
God. I mean, that's serious cultural deprivation, although one has to assume that a lot of people probably saw it in black and white on TV before they had color TVs.
Absolutely.
That must have been like a revelation to you to see it in color. And I will indeed be addressing the topic of Technicolor in my presentation. So it's a vital part of the way this movie looks. So let's plunge right in. And yes, indeed, it began in black and white. I didn't capture any of those frames, but they were trying to show the history of war in the 20th century, and there was no color film for World War I. So there was a rational reason for it. It begins with narration by the august Sir Cedric Hardwicke to give it some extra authority. And the illustrations are from a gentleman named Chesley Bonestell. And here he is on the left. I'm sorry he got paired with Werner von Braun, but Bonestell was trained as an architect and became an important illustrator of fantasy and even depictions of future space travel. That previous slide that we saw was supposed to be Mars, the cold part of Mars, where the ice caps are. And now we see the rings of Saturn, and how beautifully organized this drawing is to put some sort of debris in the foreground, slightly out of focus, so that the rings are even sharper, and there's a lot of depth in this, as there is in this painting of, well, it's an animated thing because you can see movement in the waterfall or firefall on the left, but this is Jupiter, and I just think this is stunning. The use of the red lake in the background and the mountain volcano, it's a gorgeous looking painting. This is the landing of the first projectile, we'll call it, and I just love the look of the night sky here. It may be a painting, I honestly don't know, but it looks darn good. And now's a perfectly good time to introduce the gentleman on the left is George Barnes, ASC, who photographed two films for Hitchcock, one of them Rebecca, which won the Best Picture Oscar, and it also won Barnes an Oscar for best black and white cinematography back in the days when they distinguished between color and black and white. And he's seen here with the two young stars of the film, Anne Robinson as Sylvia and Gene Barry as Dr. Clayton Forrester, internationally renowned scientist. George Barnes, by the way, had 145 film credits. And one of the explanations for his being so busy throughout his career was that not only was he good in terms of delivering outstanding visuals, but he was also very efficient economically, which made him very popular with the studios. This is one of my favorite little moments in the movie, and there are a couple of them here. This is one of the fire watchers up in the smoke tower, and while his companion is reporting the downing or the arrival of some sort of projectile, he's cheating and looking at his friend's cards. I do not know who this actor is. I searched far and wide through the IMDb credits. He's not credited on screen, but he comes in a couple of other moments. He is the guy that they call the caller at the square dance in the town. He's also sort of has a couple of lines of dialogue here and there in the group scenes. But what this scene does is it injects a little bit of humor, and it reminds us that in the midst of all this, human life is going on. These are the three sentinels, and I will refer to them much later in my segment here. They are the poor saps who are asked to just keep watch over the capsule. And they are, from left to right, William Phipps, Jack Christian, and Paul Birch. All very familiar faces in 1950s films. Almost never had significant lead roles, but they were pretty good guys, and they were trying to show peace by waving a white flag. This brought out, and this is referred to as the Cobra head, and you will see it here in profile. It was made as the airships were too. It was sculpted out of copper. And sadly, none of these artifacts remain. One theory is that they were melted down for a copper drive that the Boy Scouts were sponsoring. I don't know how true that is, but people are saying it. And this Cobra head can deliver this devastating heat ray, which basically just melts everything in its path. So these guys waving the white flag had no luck. It looks like the Martians were aggressive. I really like this shot. It's not all that great, but I just love the distant look of the fire over the horizon there and the crowd of people looking very, well, it's hard to tell that they're concerned, but they're looking at something. This is one of the aircraft designed by a Japanese American named Albert Nozaki, who did almost all of the Martian designs here, and they are quite lovely. They, at the time, were something we had not seen on a movie screen, which is something Hollywood was looking for to compete with television. And they're very inventive, and they have survived to this day. Some of these same designs were incorporated in Spielberg's remake many years later. This is the poor Uncle Matthew, the local pastor, and once again, trying to evoke sympathy or knowledge of the creator with the Martians does not work, and Uncle Matthew meets a bad end. This is an intriguing look here. These are the shields or shells that the Martians have put up around their spacecraft. And you may wonder how this was done. Well, I can show you. This was the separate effect shot that was done in the studio in miniature and then composited with the flying machines so that they look like they're actually inside them. Very clever effect. Again, this was kind of innovative for 1953. The use of Technicolor. This is our two protagonists cringing at, I've almost forgotten what it was, an explosion of some sort. And the bright green that is used to eliminate their faces is wonderful. Deep, rich, saturated Technicolor hues. They are marvelous in this film. This is one of my favorite effects shots from the movie. It looks so real to me as it did when I was, 7 years old. Um, this looks so real. The farmhouse looks real, so does the windmill, and this huge mass sliding along the surface of the earth, crashing into them. It's dazzling to me. I think it's a marvelous special effect. All of it miniatures, of course, but beautifully executed. And one of the secrets to why the miniatures look so good is that they were built large. For example, I don't have a frame of it, but the Los Angeles City Hall, probably the best known iconic landmark in that city, that model was about 6 feet tall, which made it look a lot more realistic when it came time to blow it up. This is what was referred to as the electronic eye that the Martians use. And it's interesting that they use red, green, and blue lenses to perceive color. That's kind of the basic technique of three-strip Technicolor, which this film employed. And that three-strip camera was very large. Someone described it as big as a person. So it was not easy to move it around. Here we see Jean and Anne reacting to something with red shown on their faces. They were not shy about using color in expressive ways in this film. Here we have, and it's hard to see in this frame, and it was designed to be hard to see, we see our first glimpse of one of the Martian creatures very quickly. They really did not do what I should say is a slam bang job of creating these creatures. It was kind of done at the last minute. And we have here, well, this is an interesting shock thing. Very few of them like this in this film, whereas present day horror depends upon this. But back in the day, this was darn creepy, and one can sympathize with Sylvia for screaming her head off. And here we see a close-up of one of the creatures. It's trying to cover its face with its hands. I got a frame here where we can see most of it. And it was rather elaborately designed. You'll notice those ridges on the top of the head. Those were intended to be veins or blood vessels of some sort. And someone was actually operating a mechanism to make them pulsate. Although it was so quick, the shot was so quick that it's hard to detect a lot of the extra effort they went into. I just love this shot. It has very little to do with the film otherwise, but the moon over London, and it's just strikingly beautiful, looks like black and white, and you can see the river moving in the foreground, the Thames, alive. This was something that impressed all of us kids in 1953. This is what they called the Flying Wing, which was an experimental aircraft in that day. As one commentator put it, it was not successful, but it did go on to inspire the creation of the B-2 stealth bomber, which is in use today. And none of us really have a very good idea what that looks like intentionally. Another example of the massive budget this film had for its day. The background in the far distance, the city over the mountains there, is undoubtedly a matte painting, but all these are real people. These are not little computer inserts. These are real people, and they are used. They had them stand and turn their backs to the camera for another shot celebrating the victory over the Martians at the end. But once again, they were not scrimping on the budget here. Here is another shot that I like because it shows human life ongoing in the midst of a panicky evacuation of the city. While people are running crazily around, this boy is eating an ice cream bar which fell off a truck or something. And then the camera pans over to the right to show what I hope is his dog licking up some ice cream off the pavement as well. So lots of normal human behavior going on. This is one of the shots of deserted Los Angeles, and reportedly, which is the standard technique for doing this in large cities. I believe it was Side Street, Anthony Mann's film noir shot in the Wall Street area, where they did all the shooting on Sunday. as they did here in the War of the Worlds, because they could easily wall off the streets. There was not enough traffic to be concerned about on a Sunday. Here we see the Martian machines once again, this time in full attack mode on the city of Los Angeles. This is a shot of one of the machines crashing. And one of the special effects concerns was when the machine crashed, the wires that were suspending it, and it all dealt with wires, which were rather effectively disguised for most of the film. They were concerned that the wires holding up the machine would be visible. So some clever chap, maybe it was a lady, I don't know, some clever person said, well, let's have it crash into a telephone pole first. And then when it slides down to the ground, the wires that are visible would be presumed to be telephone wires. So a little bit of misdirection here, traditional magic conjuring. And if you look carefully on the right side of the frame against the light gray wall, you can see above the spacecraft, you can see 3 or 4 wires hanging loose. Those were the ones suspending it on its normal flight pattern. The final clinch between the hero and heroine, which is beautifully used. We start on them, and then the scene pulls back slowly to reveal smoke in the church, and people kind of bewildered that there are no combat sounds anymore. And this is because the Martians are dying due to microbes that they were not immune to, as we were. I love this shot. It's a nice concluding shot. The arm was animated to move. It was a physical animation, not anything done with trick photography. And once again, the lighting, this brilliant, almost magenta red, is striking and memorable, as is this shot. It's heartbreaking, as it was to see Notre Dame in flames several years ago, and to see the Eiffel Tower in ruins is equally devastating. But now I'm going to take you to a couple of happier things. I'm going to mention, once again, Steven Spielberg's 2005 remake with marvelous, very realistic special effects. And the story involves Tom Cruise on the weekend of the invasion having his 2 children in custody, and he is trying to get them to their grandparents' house somewhere a couple of hours away. That's his goal. And here is how that arrival at Grandma and Grandpa's house was manifested in the last scene of Spielberg's remake. Who do we have playing Grandpa and Grandma? We have Gene Barry on the left and Anne Robinson on the right, both still very game people 52 years after the release of the first film. And I'm now going to leave you with something which reflects the iconography of this film, how certain images and concepts stuck. I'm going to show you a single frame cartoon image drawn by the masterful artist Jack Davis, who got his start with Mad magazine. And this was published in a Humbug magazine, a spin-off of Mad, in 1957. If you can't read the text, I will happily read it for you. The Thing from Space and You Know Who Gets Killed. Jack Davis did a series of a dozen or more of these You Know Who Gets Killed, like the race car driver who can't find his lucky baby shoes. Oh, well, I won't need them today. And you know who gets killed. The dialogue is, there's no hurry investigating the object, Professor. We'll wait till morning. You'll stand guard, won't you, officer? If anything strange happens, call me at once. What could happen? So the movie has inspired several interesting tropes, we can call them, in the science fiction genre. And that's the end of my presentation on the look of the film. There you are, Matt.
The Jack Davis reference, and also the still from the Spielberg remake. And Anne Robinson is with us today. She's like in her 94. Yes.
Nice. She was the narrator of some of the extra features on the Criterion edition, and Gene Barry made an appearance talking about how kind of bewildered he was having a lead role in a feature film. he'd been in only one theatrical film in a minor role prior to that. And so he was sort of stumbling his way through. He was a reliable actor in his era. He played Bat Masterson on TV and went on to star in Burke's Law, a show I never saw, so I don't have much comment on it. But
I have a little bit on that one. So Bat Masterson was NBC 57 to 1961. Burke's Law was ABC 63 to 65. And on Burke's Law, he played, this is so strange. Get this, a multimillionaire police captain of the Metropolitan Homicide Squad in Los Angeles.
Sure.
I think there are a lot of those.
Yeah. Oh, I would have loved to have been in the writer's room when somebody pitched that. That could have been fun.
No, it's true. He came from Manhattan, and really it was the television work and some films in the 50s. He was in The Atomic City the year before this film.
Right.
Naked Alibi, the film that I mentioned by Byron Haskin. He was in Thunder Road with Robert Mitchum, and he was in Sam Fuller's China Gate, an early film about the Vietnam War. But not a lot of credits after Burke's Law.
Yeah. And similarly, Ann Robinson found her home in TV.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of guest appearances. And I'm
Although
delighted.
apparently, if you look carefully in All About Eve, she's a hat check girl, uncredited, and that's 3 years earlier.
That's sweet. Okay. No, I really find her kind of lovable. And, there was a slide that fell out of my thing that I meant to show was when she delivers a monologue as they're hiding in the farmhouse, they've cooked breakfast or something, they're relaxing, and she tells Gene Barry about being lost as a child and how she found her way into a church. And there she found her Uncle Matthew and felt safe and protected. And it's nice when you see a script plant something like that early that's rewarding near the end, where he remembers, oh, I should look for her in a church. And it adds some nice emotional resonance to the story and the characters.
Absolutely. And any Stanley Kubrick fan would smile a bit seeing a film written by Barry Lyndon.
Yes. Well, he was a Brit and rather prolific. He wrote a lot of the sci-fi stuff. So I think he might have had a hand in House of Wax. I'm not positive on that.
So what I found out about him, his credits in the 1940s included the remake of The Lodger, I guess, with Laird Cregar. Hangover Square, also with Laird Cregar. Henry Hathaway's The House on 92nd Street, a famous, based on a true story, noir. John Farrow's The Night Has a Thousand Eyes. And then it was a cornball hit for Paramount, The Greatest Show on Earth by DeMille, and in the early 50s. And then he does a lot of TV writing after that point.
But a lot of dark stuff there before we get to The Big Circus.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was a voice. Before we get to this other person I wanted to reference, forgive me, Dan, if I may have missed something. Was there any mention made of the fisheye lens image of what the Martian sees?
Yeah,
that was fascinating.
I didn't mention it, but you're right. It was an interesting technique. I think the fisheye lens was fairly new, or at least untried in Hollywood at that point. And it made an interesting effect as they were trying to show how the Martians see us. And they had Gene Barry loom up into the lens. So
because it gave it a very modern feel. It didn't feel like an early 50s movie at that point. It seemed like something out of the 70s,
Well, I mean, that's to the film's credit, is that about the only things that really date it are the cars and the clothing, but it could have happened in the present day for a lot of reasons. One other thing I wanted to mention is the use of the Army technology, tanks, jeeps, big cannons and stuff. Well, Paramount approached the Army and said, would you like to cooperate with us and provide us with all this materiel, as it's called? And the Army said, no, you're not making us look very good there. We lose every battle we're in. So what they did was some ambitious person in the production staff contacted the Arizona National Guard, which had not as much, but they had the same equipment, and they were happy to donate it or rent it for, I hope, a small fee. So sometimes the military does not go all out for Hollywood, which is often the impression on these things.
No, it seems as though if there's to be any armed forces cooperation, it has to be 100% positive portrayal, almost on a
Yes.
propagandistic level.
Yeah.
And Paramount,
Imagine that from the United States government. It's hard to,
a
it's hard to
shocker.
yeah. Okay.
You had mentioned Cedric Hardwicke doing the introductory narration, so he is reading some passages from the H.G. Wells novel. And correct me if I'm wrong, and then we have the narrator Paul Frees taking over, who we later see as a newscaster walking around. I simply can't take him seriously when I see him in a drama because his voice became, and Gary and I talked about this a few years ago when we discussed The Manchurian Candidate, but he was famous for doing voiceover for a lot of cartoons in the 60s, like the Flintstones, Top Cat, Snuffy Smith, Crazy Cat, Bullwinkle, and Rocky. His voice was present on that. He was the voice of Captain Haddock in the English dubbed version of the TV series The Adventures of Tintin. So we see him early on narrating, and then we see him as the newsman who's trying to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah. And he wasn't bad as the newsman.
No, not at all.
Incredible. But the voice, you can't run away from your voice.
No, because his voice is all over cinema. He narrates trailers. You can hear his voice in Kubrick's Spartacus, where the slaves are being addressed. It's really funny, but he had a very, very specific, identifiable voice that we saw a lot of, or heard a lot of, I should say.
One other thought from Jay Hoberman is that one possible reason for the casting of Gene Barry is that he has a marvelous voice, very deep and rich and resonant and authoritative, the kind of person you want to be expressing scientific lore. So,
that's a good point. And
voices were very important.
The film has a lot of actors. It's one of those, we recognize these actors from films of that period, from crime pictures or Westerns. The only one that I could identify by name was Ned Glass, who Gene Barry runs into in the midst of chaos, his suitcase has been knocked over. He's picking up items. Ned Glass, character actor, we often see him playing merchants and shopkeepers. He was in the West Side Story. He was the shopkeeper there who was condemning the actions of one of the street gangs. So these character actors do appear.
And, it's worth noting, even though we talk about the big budget for this film, these people didn't get paid a lot for a day's work. And it kept the budget low, even though they could bring in all the extras for that mountainside shot of the refugees. But I think this was a very well-produced and well-designed film. Worth mentioning that the ubiquitous Edith Head did the costumes for this film. So she was everywhere in that era.
She was major at Paramount at that time.
Yeah.
And it did okay. I would say it was a break even for Paramount because it returned about $2 million in rentals, and it cost $2 million. So, but it wasn't quite the smash blockbuster. But so many films that we talk about today that are considered classics underperformed originally at the box office. Let's be honest.
But let's also be honest that Paramount certainly got a lot of money back from TV rentals and the restoration by the Criterion Collection. So again, the movie has been very well remembered, very influential. And one story that I read was that Steven Spielberg, as a boy, he saw it at roughly the same time I did, or the same age I was. It inspired him to find an 8mm print of the film. Maybe not the whole film, I don't know, but he would show it in his basement to kids in the neighborhood, charge them some coins, and pop some popcorn for them. So he was already there as a theatrical presenter, even before he got behind a camera.
There was a whole generation that I think took to the film. And in watching it last night for the first time in many years, I felt that it started gaining traction the second half. The first half seemed to me kind of leaden, and then it started to pick up once the invasion really takes off. It sort of cuts corners towards the end. I felt the end to me seemed a little abrupt, where they just kind of wound things up very, very quickly. But I'm sure others may have some thoughts as well. We would love to open up the floor to our attendees today for any questions or comments. We do have someone who is greeting us from a train in Switzerland. How cool is that?
Kathleen.
That's wonderful.
Are you there, Kathleen?
What's that?
I just said, are you there, Kathleen?
And then we have someone who mentioned, maybe this was Laurie, that Gene Barry was also in the name of the game in the late 60s, early 70s. So that is pretty cool. Oh, so that is Kathleen contacting us from Switzerland. How wonderful.
If you can chime in with a question or comment, we'd love to hear and see you if possible. And
also, before we take questions and comments from people, just a reminder that November 1st, the great Stephen Smith, the film historian, is going to be presenting a lecture on Otto Preminger's Laura online for New Plaza Cinema. And then 4 days later, our next talk back with Stephen Smith present, it'll be Dan and Stephen discussing Otto Preminger's Laura. That's October 5th. And the lecture's on, November 5th for the talk back, November 1st for the lecture. And you can go to newplazacinema.org for more information.
All right. If anyone has any questions, please use the reaction button to raise your hand. One thing I wanted to say is the scene where he's running around downtown Los Angeles, they use like the same corner, that intersection over, and either that or they had the same clock on every single building, because I noticed that when it was like, there's that clock again. Like I just kept seeing the clock. So
didn't you know that every building in Los Angeles has a clock on it, Laurie? I mean, that was
I do now.
I know that when I was doing a lecture on Los Angeles on film, which I think I did for New Plaza not long ago, I had referenced some websites that were able to identify the specific streets where he's running around, and I would not be at all surprised if they were recycling the streets by different camera angles just for the sake of convenience.
Yeah. Kathleen, you want to unmute and start your video, please?
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Kathleen.
Off the train.
Good to see you. Are you in a private compartment on the Orient Express? What is that?
No, I'm in my apartment in Switzerland right now.
Oh, okay.
I've made it off the train,
Good.
which is why I was dropping off from time to time, because I was, exiting the train and on the elevators and things. So, but anyways, it's super nice to see you all. And I just have a confession. I actually didn't get a chance to watch the movie, so I have nothing intelligent to say about the movie, but I nevertheless wanted to participate because I love hearing you guys chat about it, and then I will watch the movie afterwards.
One thing, Kathleen, I noted that you were very active on the chat on my lecture on Wednesday, and
yes,
when I have a moment, like when the clips are running, I cannot access the chat on my Zoom. The only time I can see the chat is when I'm talking, and I can't do that. So if you have any leftover comments or questions from that, we'd be happy to entertain them now. Otherwise, just
it's funny you should say that. I was thinking that I would maybe steal a little bit of your time today, but I wasn't sure if that would be, the right thing to do. But I actually think you captured most of them. I can't remember all of them now, but I do remember one of them. You made a really good point, and I just wanted to let you know that I thought it was a really good point. I had asked that most of the clips that you were showing showed a single monster sort of attacking, right? And I had asked whether or not they'd ever come in a swarm or what. And you said that it was very expensive to make up these monsters, right? So it sort of explains why they did one up, right, as opposed to a whole army of them. So
money talks in Hollywood, but if you remember,
that's what you said.
the scenes I showed of a later Ray Harryhausen film, particularly where Jason was protecting the Golden Fleece from a Hydra-headed monster with 7 heads.
Yes, yes, yes.
Classic sequence with the skeletons sword fighting is
skeletons.
Everybody remembers that, and most people remember Jason and the Argonauts as their favorite sci-fi film of that era. Maybe fantasy film is a better description, but yeah, I could not deal with the 60s. The 50s was enough for me. Maybe the next.
I have another question that I had asked in the chat from the other day, and that was in the what is it? The creature from the
Black
Lagoon or something?
That's the one.
Creature from the Black Lagoon. Yes, and boy, oh boy, that getup he was wearing. On the one hand, it looked like a wetsuit, right? But on the other hand, he had all that mask on and everything, and I was just wondering just how difficult might it have been for the actor to wear that getup and swim under the water like that.
His name was Riku Browning, and he didn't do much acting. He did a lot of stunt work, and apparently he was a very large man. And you can see that when he's next to ordinary human beings in the film. I don't believe there was any aqualung attached to it, so he had to swim on his own lung power in that.
Wow, I have some information. Yeah. I have some information I can share. So the breathing effects were created by 3 rows of flaring gills, which could be made to pulsate realistically. The mouth and chin were based on those of a frog, and following the sculpting of the creature outfit, various segments were cased in molds, then produced in foam rubber. The creature was entirely green, save for vivid red lips, and was covered with ichthoid scales. I thought I would add that.
Well, thank you, Max.
Sounds very fashionable.
Now, some of you may be wondering, is this as scary that this guy has information like this at his fingertips? The only reason I do is because I talked a little bit about the creature a few nights ago on another presentation, so I had it on my laptop.
Oh, okay. That's good. I was impressed. I thought you Googled it right away.
Well, thank you, Kathleen.
Anyway,
thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments, and we'll see you again, we hope.
Thank you.
All right.
Good. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.
Next up we have is Sheila. Can you unmute and start your video, please?
Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to thank you for showing a movie with Gene Barry.
Huh?
Because when I was a kid and Gene Barry was on Bat Masterson, I was madly in love with him. I was probably 8 years old at the time. And it never occurred to me when I was a kid that these various stars on TV had a movie history. So it was years later that I discovered, for example, William Bendix, who was The Life of Riley, or Father Knows Best, Robert Young. I never knew that they were movie stars before. As a kid, I thought, oh, they showed up on TV and they were great and I loved them. So anyway, it was just funny to see Gene Barry in a movie. So thank you.
You're welcome. Let me just say that's one of our missions. That's why we're here, is to educate you on the broader careers of some of these people. Not only was Robert Young in movies, but his wife in Father Knows Best, Jane Wyatt.
Jane Wyman,
Lost
right.
Horizon. She was the female lead in Lost Horizon. So there's a lot of that.
Delighted we brought that to your attention, Sheila. That's terrific. Sheila.
Okay, just a reminder that on November 1st, Stephen Smith will be giving his lecture on Laura, and then on November 5th, we'll be doing a talk back on Laura.
Thank you, Lori, for promoting the Laura lecture.
It's a bit of a tongue twister, but we look forward to seeing everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.